HKS Architects, which has historically been known as a architect of record on complicated projects, but has been trying to do more interesting design work. The studio that I work with, which we call LINE because the Laboratory for Intensive Exploration is a mouthful, is only about 10, 11 people right now, trying to work within the context of a 1,500-person firm and do interesting work. And I thought I would talk about some of the work we've been doing recently that's related to architecture, but not necessarily architectural, and sort of, I guess, couch it in a narrative of like the way technology has been sort of forcing us to make changes to the way we work for the time that I've been working in architecture, at least over the past 15 to 20 years. You know, like I said, when I got started, we were AOR, was our sort of big thing. This was the Grand Avenue project that Gary Partners designed, and we were the AOR for. And you know, this came along a little bit after I started. My first project at HKS, because I was like a first or second year undergrad who knew nothing about architecture, I was detailing a ceiling. That was the entire context of my first project. So I was pretty low risk hire, even though I knew nothing about architecture. But they hired me because I knew BIM, and at the time BIM was like the new buzzy thing that was happening in the mid-2000s. So I came on board thinking I knew what BIM was, but not really knowing what it was in the context of actual work. So they put me to work on this tiny little ceiling project, and they just told me to build an entire as-built model, even though I just needed a ceiling, just to have me spend time where they don't need to sit over my shoulder every day. But eventually, like, the work I did there, and I was building a ton of like, complicated parametric families and sort of weird geometric things, led to me getting to work on a project like this, which was like the culmination of my BIM, I guess, history, because it was like a weird project. Even though it looks fairly rectilinear, there was a lot of like weird, funky geometry in there. But sort of around the time that project sort of died off because of the Great Recession, it sort of like never made it through. You know, the idea of computational design started to come up with like explicit history was coming out in like 2007, 2008. Generative components was certainly exciting. So it was sort of a natural transition for me to go from the sort of like complicated parametric models to being able to work computationally on, you know, major projects like this. So I was part of the initial concept design for the competition for this project, and then came back a little bit more towards the end to do some of the work on detailing the facade and trying to get it finished up for construction. And then sort of like the one big one that we've done sort of in recent memory was SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California, where the Rams and the Chargers play. And we spent a huge amount of time on this project, probably like 6 or 7 years from when we first got the project to when it was actually done. And it was a massive amount of like work that went into it. My team was responsible for the roof, which is this perforated metal piece here. Then you can see the one touchdown point where it reaches the ground. You know, 30 some odd thousand unique panels that all had to be sort of coordinated and dealt with. Was a lot of work, and we got it done. It was one of the sort of major components of the project that we delivered under budget. I think there was only 1 or 2 RFIs for the entire roof because it was so well known by the time we got to construction. But kind of around when I was working on this one, I was running into the issue of like, we're putting all this work into like these kind of point solutions that have come up today of like a really complicated building that we don't really know how to translate any of the work that we've done on this to other projects. And certainly people are asking for it, but it's such a bespoke solution that we weren't sure where to go for it. So I was trying to think a little bit more about how we can sort of leverage what we've learned and sort of like generalize it a little bit more and sort of get it more into the firm. And certainly there are some lineages. This is a pavilion we did that obviously harkens back to the SoFi Stadium. Similar material, similar processes, slightly different, you know, scale and context. This one's in Dallas. It's next to the office where I work. But, you know, still even on this one, there's things that we did that were relatively interesting and sort of complicated that we didn't really have a good way to hand off to other people that didn't have the same skill set that we already had. And unfortunately, around this time, you know, we've got, you know, pandemics that we're dealing with and a lot of uncertainties. So like, we kind of couched the whole idea of like, how do we sort of like, you know, build up whether it's tools or whether it's knowledge or what it is, how do we translate this sort of knowledge that we've been building up to other people in the firm? But more recently, we get, generative AI art, right, like is coming into it, like in the last 24 months. Certainly, we've been really excited about, the idea of what it could do, large language models too in particular. But, you have the fundamental problem that like Magritte's treachery of images, like this is not a cat. The images we were producing are not architecture. It's an idea that we're trying to get to, but it doesn't really save us any time. It doesn't really get us anywhere besides other idea generation. But we felt like we needed to respond to it, but respond to it in a different way than we had to like BIM or computational design, because there wasn't an obvious avenue for it, for us at least, that we were seeing. Because our certain concerns are like, are we in the middle of an economic bubble of AI generated, whatnots that we've, are just jumping on late to the bandwagon. Certainly the hype curve that we've looked at earlier, maybe a little bit more explicitly in red here. But certainly like trying to like be aware that like technology it's a dangerous slope if you sort of like try to latch onto it at the wrong time, and especially if it's something that you think is going to like fundamentally change the way you work. So we set about and we're like, okay, we're going to be really pragmatic about this. We're going to be really sort of research based on how we approach this. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Rolly Hudson, who's working with us in Ireland, has a master's degree in computer science, and he was like, okay, well, we're going to do this systematic literature review of what AI technology can do for us. So he found this paper that's got like this nice workflow where you sort of define the PICOC synonyms, which I assume they pronounce peacock, because why wouldn't you? You formulate your questions, you sort of like choose your sources that you trust that you're going to look through, like, pretty typical stuff for research. And they gave an example of like what some of this stuff looks like, and this one being for smart, manufacturing, but it starts to look like a software development, project planning workflow where, who's this tool for, what is the actual intervention we're going to be doing, how do we measure outcomes for it? So we thought it was a good process to start with, so we tried to fill it out ourselves, and we felt like we had a lot of white space left in the chart because we weren't really sure what kind of questions we were trying to ask, because we weren't really steeped in the industry enough, we thought, to sort of try to go about doing more with it. So we just kind of started playing with it and just trying to think about where we actually are contextually. The generative AI stuff is a pretty small part of a really large, long existing body of research. I think the field of AI has been on Earth longer than I have, certainly, so there's a lot of depth to it there. And we don't want to get too caught up in just kind of one singular instance of it necessarily either. So we tried to come up with a couple of approaches on the short term, certainly trying to look at what resources we already had available to us, rather than trying to chase and sign up for all the different sort of AI services or services that claim that they're AI at the very least that are popping up in the industry. What's already there that we have some access to, basically the cloud services we're already paying for, and just trying to understand what the different parts are and how we can start trying to find ways to fit it into our workflows. And sort of one of the first like prototypes we did was basically, okay, well, let's just take ChatGPT and we'll put it on our own website so that if people are asking questions to it, they're at least asking through our channels rather than just going to other channels. So it ties into our authentication services, and it's sort of a familiar place or sort of exercise of people to get to something like this. But it's a really sort of low-end thing where it's just like, here's a service that people kind of want. We don't know what it's going to be used for, but at least if they're asking the questions, we can also track what kind of questions they're asking, so then we can start building up responses to what people are looking for. Certainly, DALL-E is another one. We're using Microsoft's cloud services, so they're pretty tight with the OpenAI crowd, so there's a lot of that stuff in there. But really just sort of like a few initial things to get people like to have something to play around with and for us to start acquiring data to understand what they want. And then we started trying to open it up from there and look for other ways that we can use it. There's a process or a method called retrieval augmented generation, which I think was initiated by the Meta engineers, or some engineers from Meta at the very least. which is basically taking, the generative text of large language models and augmenting it with some cognitive search so that you can get like useful search. I don't know if you guys have intranets that are as bad as ours, but like trying to search for information of our internal resources is a really tough thing to do, which seems like it shouldn't be. So we took a body of sort of data that was related to design excellence, as we call it, measures of design excellence, sort of retrained the model based on that data set, and then had it where we could ask questions of, like in this case, how does roof design help with sort of passive strategies? And, it'll give you a response back, a summary of the data. It'll give you sort of links back to the original source on our company intranet, but also tying it into other work that's been going on in the background for the last several years of like tracking knowledge and experience of our employees so that we can find employees that have the relevant knowledge to what you're asking for. So if you have questions, you know who you can ask about it, case studies and the like of that. And then it's just sort of looking at kind of other things that we could do with the tools at hand, in this case, this is a photo sort, algorithm. Again, it's fairly off the shelf. It's not a lot to it. But you can go to a site visit and take a bunch of pictures and upload it to the service and start querying it, and it'll give you responses back. There's been a handful of other ones that we've looked at as far as taking, building code and loading it in and trying to query building code, or whether it's lead information. There's a guy in our Atlanta office that's been doing a couple little chatbots based on those concepts. Starting to read through contract documents and try to extract relevant information from those as far as what the basic requirements are, who the client is, where they're located, so we can start using that information and building it out into other systems that we've got in place as well. And then sort of longer term, we're trying to think of like what else we can start to do with some of these tools, because eventually we're going to want to sort of branch out from there and try to engage more with the field of AI itself, and rather than just the generative AI stuff, and start leveraging that within what we're doing at HKS. And we also have a sort of another existing sort of body of work that's been going on for a number of years, which is just trying to understand the data that we're sort of bringing into the office on a regular basis. We've got a couple of tools that have been built up, sort of pre-existing this AI research stuff that relates to what is the basic information that we need for tracking projects, for tracking clients, for tracking the work that we do, and starting to build out a fairly robust sort of object model and framework for what we can do to represent that, so we can start doing something meaningful with it on the back end. Hopefully eventually tying it into machine learning or of some kind. We haven't gotten there yet, but we've got the foundations of building that data set. And then sort of expanding, beyond a project. We've got, like I said, there's a bunch of other sort of resources that we're looking at, or data points that we're looking at to start to track, and then bringing that stuff in from trying to read client models and then trying to leverage that somewhere on the back end leads us to like, what is an actual architectural object model? There's certainly aspects of it that are out there, I think, but like, how do you represent a design? Not necessarily just the components of the design, but like one design versus another. Because if you want to do kind of an iterative flow, you have to have some way to represent that. So we're trying to think through what our framework is going to look like for that, what the object model is going to look like. There's certainly some opinions that we have for that, or some of us have for that, for what that needs to look like or can look like. But we would like to be fairly adaptable and open to change for what that needs to be. And then certainly trying to think of, once we get that in place, we have a fair number of research projects that are sort of like what the Core Studio and Thornton Tomasetti have done. We've got a research incubator group or team that, or several teams now that are doing sort of like these like startup projects through the firm that are getting approval and funding and time to be able to do these kinds of projects. And a lot of them start to center around AI. So trying to think of like, how do we set things up so that you can actually do what you're asking to do and sort of build out these object models for it. And that's kind of all I've got today for right now, just kind of running through some of the current things that we've been doing. Yeah.